Hello, my name is Matt Whitman. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and here's exactly what's going to happen in this conversation. We're going to talk about the ideas of servanthood and slavery in Bible times, in the ancient Near East, in classical Greece, in classical Rome, in Judea. And it's very difficult for us to have this conversation without immediately summoning to mind and imprinting anachronistically on the first century our notions of slavery from the transatlantic slave trade, from the American slave trade, from the British slave trade, from the antebellum South. And while the transatlantic slave trade and American slavery has some things in common with slavery in the ancient world, they're different. And so to think clearly about this and to understand important words from Jesus, examples where he includes the notions of servanthood and slavery, we got to disambiguate these two things just a little bit and compare and contrast one awful institution with a different flavor of awful institution from another time and another place in history. So that's what we're tearing into. And here is exactly the passage that prompts us to have to go there. In Matthew 24, Matthew's recording the fifth of the five great speeches around which the book of Matthew is structured. The disciples came to Jesus and they were like, hey, sounds like you're going to die and be resurrected and you're going to be gone for a while and then you're coming back later and like the temple's going to get destroyed or something. Can you just walk us through what it's going to look like when everything goes down? How is history going to unfold? Jesus gives them some broad stroke descriptions of what that's going to be like, but nothing specific enough for them to obsess about it. Rather, his instruction to the disciples is to be ready, and he spells that out at the end of his rundown about the unfolding of history here in Matthew 24:42. In light of all of that, Jesus says, therefore, keep watch because you don't know on what day your Lord will come. Aha, that's the thesis statement. That's the main point of everything in Matthew 24. That's what you got to fixate on if you want to interpret all of this. That's the cipher. That phrase speaks to Jesus' motivations in everything he's saying here. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. Okay, so it's just an analogy that makes the same point. So you must be ready because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Now, in that little passage I just read, we still haven't introduced the idea of servants and slaves, but we're talking about an owner of the house. In the first century AD in Judea, literally every member of the audience would have pictured, owner of the house. Okay, so that's a big house. There's probably some acreage. They got people raising crops. There's some people there whose job it is to keep watch and provide a little bit of security. There would be household servants and field servants. There would probably be some servants in charge of instructing this owner's children and instructing the children of other servants. And there would be some accountants who manage the books and manage businesses. The phrase owner of the house would have caused them to picture a man with servants/slaves, but they also would have pictured something that did not look like the antebellum South. We'll get into more of what those distinctions are in just a minute. Well, straight out of that, Jesus rolls into another example that would involve a household, masters, servants, etc. I think they're related. He says, who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It'll be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. I tell you the truth, he'll put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is away for a long time, and then he begins to beat his fellow servants and eat and drink with drunkards. Well, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour he's not aware of. He'll cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I promise we'll get to that last verse and talk about the scariness of it as we move forward a little bit later on. But for the purposes of our conversation today, that servant language is unmissable. It's all over everything. We're describing a type of household that does not sound like the type of household you live in or were raised in. Now, most of the time in our conversations, I'm reading from the New International Version. Sometimes I have a New Living Translation in front of me. Sometimes I have an English Standard Version. Those all have a little bit different translation philosophies. But I think all three of them use the term servant in this passage the same way. And I have an ESV. I can just look. Hang on a second. It's an English Standard Version. This one's real popular with the Reformed types. And this study Bible is beautiful. Who then is the faithful and wise servant? Yeah, there it is. Okay, but it does acknowledge in the ESV down here in the bottom that bond servant might be a preferable translation for some. So most modern translations are going to look at the agreed upon original Greek language written down in the first place here and be like, okay, we're going to translate that servant. I think the New American Standard Translation, which tends to be more, no pun intended, slavishly literalistic, is going to use the term slave, where most translations use the term servant. And this is one of those places where I think it's reasonable for the insider to Christianity or the outsider who's just curious about it and likes to learn more about it to raise their hand and be like, a second, I'm going to make the hand raising, please call on me sound. I got a question. Call on me. I got my fingers back here. Yes, you in the back with the question. Yeah, doesn't that seem like a really huge deal? Because like those words mean super, super, super different things. And some Bibles say it one way and some Bibles say it another. Yes, person in the back. That is a completely reasonable question. I'm glad you raised your hand for a super long time and made grunting sounds to get my attention because it is fair. Those words do mean different things. Well, what does the original Greek say? Well, I got my Reader's Greek New Testament right here. You do not need to get one of these. You do not need to learn how to read ancient Greek to understand the Bible every now and then. It is kind of handy to look things up. And it's okay, so I go looking through here. Doulos. D-O-U-L-O-S. And look at this Greek New Testament. It's literally just a Greek New Testament. It's not a Cracker Jack's decoder where you can go through and it decodes every word for you. It's like this word means that word. This word means that word. Well, then you just would have a literal translation. It's not what it works. The thing was written in Greek. Reading it in Greek, if you're up for putting in the enormous amount of work, I suppose is profitable because you're reading it in the original language. But the truth of the matter is no matter how much work you put into it, your native tongue isn't ancient Greek. I know this because of there are no more ancient Greeks. So even if you're reading it in ancient Greek, you're still translating it in your brain into not ancient Greek, and words mean different things at different times. So it's not like you can just go to the people who are in charge of the English Standard Version or the New International Version and be like, you people are frauds. You translated it servant, should have been slave because the word doulos, it means slave. Well, you can disagree with the translation decision, but translation is a little bit art and a little bit science. And one philosophy of translation says whatever the word in the most literal sense means, even if it doesn't exactly convey the same meaning now, you still use that word. And that's that. And let people do the work to go and learn historical context and they can figure it out. Another translation philosophy is to say, well, if the word doesn't mean that anymore and another word has replaced it because of the unfolding of history and what has happened, you got to go with the English word that makes more sense with the obvious intended meaning of the use of the word in the original language. And some people look at that right there and they're like, that is my problem with Christianity. That's my problem with the Bible. It's unreliable. Too many human hands on it. For me, I look at it and I'm like, dang, that is a feature, not a bug. That's a whole lot of people looking at it. That's a whole lot of transparency. That's a whole lot of accountability. And it's not like, oh, we just don't know what those words were. No, we got a bajillion manuscripts from the classical world that say what the words were. We know what word was used here in Matthew 24. The word that Matthew recorded that Jesus used for servant was doulos. And further, we know that that word would have been understood by his audience to mean slave. But that raises another question. How do we know that? Because a lot of times I will hear a sermon or an internet thing where the Hebrew or the Greek, the two main languages that the Bible's made out of, it gets quoted and somebody's like, well, it meant this. And if you understand that it meant that, then you better understand the nuance of the passage. And now on to my next point. But I'm like, again, do we just have like a decoder or something? And it's just a simple little like dictionary. I mean, how do you know? How do you go and research what a word meant in Greek in the first century in Judea? And the answer to that is basically twofold. One, you have the Bible tradition itself, how the Bible was translated even into Latin in the early days, how it was circulated, what it seems to have meant to Christians, what Christians wrote about it. You can basically reverse engineer an entire dictionary of ancient Greek to English just from those sources. But the second way you know is extra biblical sources, because there's a whole lot of Greek that is still floating around from the first century and the first several centuries before the time of Jesus, and you can just go and look at that stuff and see how people used it. And a lot of it's really well preserved. Like all of you have heard of Plato. All of you have heard of Aristotle. Both of these guys used the word doulos. Aristotle used it extensively in his book that I guess we just call Politics, and Plato used it extensively in his most famous work called The Republic. Now, what Aristotle and Plato thought about slavery gives us some insight as to exactly what this practice looked like. But when they used the word doulos, and when students for ensuing centuries used the word doulos, when students of Greek philosophy during the lifetime of Jesus saw the word doulos in the works of Aristotle and Plato, they all understood that it meant slave. And that was exactly the right term to conjure in the mind of the reader in the first century AD, exactly what slavery was in the Mediterranean world. However, because history is unfolded, and because the transatlantic slave trade happened, and because slavery in the style of trafficking exists today, slavery conjures a very different meaning. We only got like halfway through what I wanted to do today. So we've talked a little bit about the word behind servant/slave in the New Testament. Next time around, we're going to talk a little bit more about what it means. What were the societal and cultural practices behind that? And for the big bunch of you who just jumped in here in the last couple of weeks and are recent to this thing, you're probably like, whoa, this is, where are we going with all of this? We do this from time to time. That is a deep dive into historical context and all of that, because what we find is that it usually really pays off. Instead of looking at a difficult to understand passage and just being like, I feel like it means this, or somebody else might feel like it means this. Well, we still acknowledge everybody can make of it whatever they're going to make of it. But what we make of it is then rooted in something much more concrete and demonstrable. We're understanding the words, the terms, the things that are in play more like the original audience. And that gives us a better shot at understanding the most influential book in history that includes a whole bunch of words from the most influential character in history. And getting that understood and in our hip pocket is the goal of the whole thing. So more history and culture deep dive next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.